we need to turn these on, or will they?
Yes, you have to turn them on the side. Oh, it is on.
Okay. Okay. Cool. They'll come on the map. Actually, yours is not. Yeah. Yeah. Are you going to say
it? Makes you want to say
it. Even if you can't.
All right.
I'm going to have my hands full here. Keeping this under control.
Good to see you again. Jim, how are you?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning for our 2017 Capitol Hill National Security Forum. We're going to go ahead and begin with our first panel discussion in this room on the next steps in cybersecurity. I'll turn it over to Tal Copan from here.
Thank you. The men sitting next to me probably don't need much by way of introduction, but for clarity's sake. So to my right, we have Dean Garfield, President and CEO of ITI, Congressman John Ratcliffe of Texas, former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff, and Congressman Jim Langevin of Rhode Island. So we have a short time to get right into it. I was hoping that each of you could think for a minute and describe one area where we have sort of a recent win in the topic of cybersecurity, and then one area where, I don't want to say failing, but perhaps we have a lot more to do, and then we'll take the conversation from there. So Dean, if you'd like to start.
Sure. I get to go first, so it's easier for me. So I would say, I cheat a little bit by saying it's a close call between the work that NIST is doing around cyber, the cyber framework, and the continual update of it because of the collaboration between the private sector and the bill that was passed last year out of Congress on cyber information sharing. The one area where I think we can do a better job is, in spite of 3 executive orders in the last 5 years focused on cybersecurity, the level of coordination is not what it should be, and so we end up with a high degree of redundancy that complicates our ability to advance cybersecurity well.
Well, thanks everyone for being here. Tal, good to see you again. As far as starting out with a recent win, to my mind it goes into the response of the Department of Homeland Security with respect to the WannaCry virus. We saw the impact that it had over in Europe, and we saw that the impact that it didn't have here in the United States, and for the criticism that the Department of Homeland Security has sometimes maybe deserved. In this case, they deserve a lot of praise. It worked exactly the way it was supposed to in terms of coordinating with the private sector and leveraging with different industries. And so that was, I think, a great sign of the progress that's being made at the Department of Homeland Security. Now, conversely, an area where we're maybe struggling or stuck a little bit, I agree with Dean in terms of the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act being really important legislation, but one of the things that we're trying to accomplish there, many of you that are familiar with it, the Einstein intrusion detection part of it has really been deployed well. The CDM portion of it, not so well. It's been a little bit too long in terms of the implementation phase where we are right now, and that's just an area where we need to get better.
Well, I think that was a win, I think, in the WannaCry case. I'd say another win was the indictment of 4 individuals with respect to the Yahoo hack, 500 million accounts stolen, in particular the fact that 2 FSB agents were indicted. I mean, that gave us an ability for the first time to talk publicly about what is sometimes an unholy relationship between state actors and criminal groups that serve their mutual interest in a way that really poses a threat to national security. On the loss side, of course, the Yahoo hack is a loss, as was the WannaCry. And I think one of the areas we really have to start to focus on is the Internet of Things. We have a large and increasing number of devices that are wirelessly connected that do not even have the basic capability to update and pursue security. And that is going to become more and more of a challenge for us as we go forward, as indicated by the Mirai exploit, which was used to generate an enormous denial of service attack against a domain name registry using like video cameras and thermostats. And that's going to become more and more of a problem.
Now, great to see you again. It's great to be with my fellow panelists, and good morning, everyone. I guess I would go back to what we said earlier on the recent Cybersecurity Act of 2015. Since going forward, cybersecurity is never going to be a problem that, or an issue that we're going to solve. We're never going to be 100% secure. It's going to require more multi-stakeholder processes and collaboration. So information sharing, I think, is going to be key. But then another area where I think we've had great success is the recent FDA guidance on post-market cybersecurity guidance for medical devices, by way of example. So there was an effort where there's a public-private partnership that I think had a very good result. That in addressing Secretary Sherdoff's point about this Internet of Things, we have to be particularly concerned about things like medical devices, things that could be life-threatening if compromised. So those were two areas, but obviously still a lot of work to do.
Well, we've already had our public-private partnerships, our first one of the day. That's, talked about such an important thing in this sector, right? Government doesn't want to take too heavy a hand. They want to work with the private sector where a lot of innovation can happen. At the same time, you can't leave it all to the private sector. You want to spur folks to actually take up these issues. If I can put our sort of private sector representatives on the spot, Dean and Secretary Chertoff, how how much did the information sharing bill, which we spent practically a decade trying to get passed, how much did that actually move the ball? Has the private sector actually felt a difference from it? And what next steps would the private sector want from Congress, if any, now that we finally got that bill done?
So I do think it was helpful, but I do think there are a couple things we need to do to really move this to the next level. One is I do think that it's got to be mutual, and one of the challenges when you're in the private sector is getting information that's classified in the hands of people who have the security obligations at private firms. Right now, to get a clearance, you not only have to have, obviously, the background check done, but you have to have a need to have the information, and that typically means you have to be a contractor. But if we're going to say to the private sector, you all own the responsibility shared with the government to protect our infrastructure, you've got to give them the tools they need, and that means we've got to find a way to get those clearances to the people who actually have the operational responsibility in the private sector. The other thing is, I think, and we have seen an example of this in the financial area, a closer relationship, not just in responsively sharing information or reactively sharing information when there's an attack or an exploit, but actually proactively helping the government understand what the private sector needs to have collected in order to anticipate problems that may come in the future. So I think 8 of the big banks now have set up something called the FSMARC, which is supposed to be a deeper, more engaged mechanism for sharing with the government. And as I understand it, part of the idea would literally be to help task the intelligence community. This is the kind of thing we need to understand and see if we're going to build up our defenses and anticipate rather than react to problems.
Yeah, I completely agree. It is intended as a bidirectionally sharing program where the private sector is sharing with the government is sharing with the private sector in real time, and that's not occurring at the level that it should today. And so it is not clear to me necessarily that legislation is necessary to accomplish that. I think we can do that with the oversight that Congress continues to have to encourage that level of sharing. I think when we think about a cyber threat, we often think that it is human beings looking at that threat information. Much of that is shared machine to machine. And so encouraging with respect to I guess, the Mr. Chertoff mentioned the need to have an important clearance as a part of the sharing of information, which leads to the delay of information being shared. I think given the fact that so much of this information is shared machine to machine, we can expedite the sharing of information, get that information out so threats can be prevented and there can be an intervention without creating any leakage risks.
All right, so no one gets off the hook to put my lawmakers on the spot now. One of the interesting things about cybersecurity is that it actually tends to be fairly bipartisan. We've recently seen this administration put out an executive order on cybersecurity that's honestly not terribly different from a lot of what the previous administration was doing when you compare a lot of areas where that's not the case. At the same time, I'm sure, as you are well aware, sometimes it can be difficult to move things through Congress where there's a lot of consensus because the big political fights take up a lot of the oxygen. So to both of you, how do you see your role in trying to move the ball as real thought leaders on this subject? And how do you navigate that sort of weird bipartisan but also not really headline making nature of the game?
So if I, in theory anyway, if I had my way, if I could wave a magic wand, it would be to streamline the process in Congress in terms of the number of committees that have oversight jurisdiction over cyber. I don't think it helps our government agencies, by way of example, to have to report to be overseen by so many committees. And if I've heard the complaint numerous times that they have to spend so much time on the Hill in hearings that they don't have time to do their job back at the department, for example. And also, that would help, by the way, with respect to legislation. Now, the problem is I don't see that changing anytime soon. Again, in theory, I'd like to see us streamline it, but it would take really changing the rules and the speaker really laying down the law. And so far, neither, whether it's under Democratic leadership or Republican leadership, really haven't had that will to streamline that process.
So my perspective on this is, as Secretary Chertoff knows, I was a former terrorism prosecutor and United States attorney. And so always focused on, the primary role of the federal government being to provide for the common defense. And what that has traditionally meant is securing the sovereignty and integrity of our territorial borders. Focus always has been on the physical borders. Increasingly, we are all seeing that it is the invasion of our digital borders, which is our greatest national security threat. That has to be the messaging for this not to become an area that becomes too contaminated with partisanship. You're right, Tal. It has not been. My concern is that it's starting to be. So when you look at Russian interference with our election, this is really the first time where I'm starting to see the cybersecurity issues get contaminated, frankly, by partisanship, where I wish that was not the case, because we all need to recognize that we are behind the curve on this. And I see this as our greatest growing national security challenge, and we don't really have the opportunity. We can't afford to be fighting amongst ourselves. So I think it's incumbent on leadership. It needs to come from the White House. It needs to come from Jim and I as members of Congress, and it needs to also come from the private sector as well.
You must have read my mind, because you teed up what I wanted to talk about next, which was exactly that. There's so many sectors you could look at for cybersecurity threats. But yesterday, on both sides of the Hill, we had hearings about elections and, tampering with elections. And obviously the hacks of emails that were put out and the spread of propaganda, that's one layer of cyber, but there's a lot of talk about actual election infrastructure. And we don't believe that piece of it was tampered with in this election cycle, but it could be. And the last administration designated elections as critical infrastructure. It was interesting yesterday on the Senate side, you had a panel of sort of federal representatives saying this is great, it's going to really spur change, and then you had a panel of state representatives saying they weren't so pleased with that. Using that as a test case, what can we do before the 2018 midterms to ensure that our elections remain free and fair and protected? Let's start with Congressman Langevin.
Okay. So as a former Secretary of State, I have some unique experience or insights into elections processes. And I'm fine with the designation of elections equipment and processes as critical infrastructure, but I don't want to see it, in any way, the federal government in any way being perceived or coming in as taking over or running local elections, and we don't want that. What we do want is sufficient reach back so that if a state feels that it's overwhelmed and doesn't have the resources to protect the integrity of its election system, then they can reach back easily and seamlessly to whether it's FBI or U.S. CERT or the NKIC or other federal resources, make that available, but only at the state's request. The other thing that I do believe we need to do, and I do see John's point, and I don't want to see the Russian involvement, interference in our elections as becoming a partisan issue. In my mind, I don't feel that it is, but I could see John's point that it could be politicized. There is a new paradigm clearly on the part of the Russians in wanting to interfere in the elections and democracies of Western countries. And we need to make sure that that cannot happen. So I do think getting to the bottom of what happened, how it happened, and what we can do to inoculate ourselves from further interference is paramount. And just the last thing I'll say is that I do have high confidence in the integrity of our elections systems itself. Again, as a former Secretary of State, I know that and I know many have heard this, that the election systems themselves are so diverse, unconnected, if you will. Rhode Island is, for example, unique in that we do have a statewide system, but we're small enough that we can do that. Most states, they have their local cities or towns or counties are responsible for their purchasing and running their own election equipment. And most of it is not connected to the internet. And so it is a high degree of integrity. And I think you just have, election mission assurance is the best way of protecting ourselves. The PR side of it and the information that the Russians were able to hack into, that's one thing. But especially maintaining the election integrity has to be paramount.
And Secretary Chertoff, as someone who's been in this position before, as DHS, how do you work with 50 states plus, exponential number of counties, knowing that it only takes one to really not step up their game to pose a huge risk?
Well, I think part of what we need to do is to look at different, maybe this works better, look at different layers of what might be targeted. And I agree with Representative Langevin. I think the actual voting process is so widely distributed that it'd be very tough to really do a material, have material impact on the election. I know, for example, both in Maryland and D.C., where I voted the last few times, they actually generate a paper ballot. It's scanned in, but they actually have the paper. But there are two other things I think we do have to look at. I think here information sharing and education might be something DHS could do. One is the possibility of misdirection. Someone like the Russians using social media to target voters and mislead them about whether they are registered or when voting is or where they should go to vote. That wouldn't affect the actual voting process, but it might affect whether people go to the polls or not. And that, I think, could be something we need to address. The second issue is reporting of results. Apparently in the last couple of years in Ukraine, there was an effort to hack into the databases of some of the media and actually distort the election reporting by the media in real time. And it was discovered, and ultimately, the purpose of the hack was to have the media report that the Russian-favored candidate had won. It was discovered, and it was not successful. But you can understand that the confidence might be shaken if media reported an outcome, and then it turned out 2 or 3 weeks later that when they did the actual count, it was the opposite outcome. And, since I kind of believe the Russian game here is more to create discomfort and disbelief than it is to actually think they can turn an election, I think that helping to educate the media as well as the people who maintain voter rolls and things like that is an important part of what the federal government can do.
Yeah, I think there's also the risk of threatening the underlying platform. So one of the things that has led to the success of the internet for society and economically is that it's an open, international, integrated, and interoperable platform. To the extent that part of our reaction is to move away from those essential elements of the internet, then they win. And so as we go about reacting and coming up with rules that make us more cyber secure, it's critical that we maintain the elements of the internet that has led it to thrive.
And Congressman Ratcliffe, to put you on the spot a little extra, you talked about the politicization of this issue. Do you think the administration is appropriately concerned about this piece of the puzzle, election infrastructure, even as we see some politics about what actually took place during our election?
Well, I think they're finding out. I mean, the exchange yesterday between Congressman Gowdy and former Secretary Johnson, I think was pretty telling. The former Secretary was quick to designate this as critical infrastructure, and then was pretty quick to back off of that based on the pushback and the response. And I think this administration is likewise learning that this is an area where there's not a lot of consensus, and there's a couple of reasons for this. And one of the problems is I think it's sort of the nose under the tent argument. From a state level, there's just concern about, well, the federal government being there and being available, but then ultimately becoming involved on an extent that is not wanted or not welcome. And the other part of it is still there's a trust issue, and all of these things that are happening are not helping. They're in fact eroding the trust level in the federal government. Why should we want your help when we're looking at what's happening at the national level on these issues and everything that's going around with respect to information not being kept in a classified way and everything else that is sort of all become conflated around this Russian meddling election issue is not inspiring confidence at the state level that they want federal help here. So we've got to rebuild that trust, and that's my concern. Back to the politicization of this and the partisanship is it'll be that much harder to regain that trust if we lose it through the way this discussion has been meandering.
So another facet of this, which we saw in the Russian incidents, is that a lot of this comes down to the individual person, right? It only takes one person to sleepily click on a Gmail phishing scam and put in their password without thinking about what they're doing. And we've all seen how sophisticated those phishing emails have gotten, and it can disrupt the whole system in that one instant. So Dean, I find as a consumer who has some awareness of these issues, it can be very difficult for me as an individual to navigate. The iPhone now tells you you're connecting to an unsecure Wi-Fi network, but it doesn't tell you what to do next. It just says, if you own this Wi-Fi network, please secure it. So what more should the technology industry be doing to empower individuals to engage their own cyber hygiene, and what could the federal government do to help you in that effort?
It's a great question. I think the thing that we're doing is trying to do what we do best, which is innovate, and make sure that we're thinking about cybersecurity as a part of the design element of technology. And so the vulnerabilities of an individual having to be smart enough to make a decision is not something that we should necessarily rely on. And so baking in the ability for the technology to be able to discern things that are anomalous, things that don't act consistent with what is expected is a part of what we're doing. Another part of it is exactly what you pointed to, Tal, which is just education and cascading what we know through our supply chain and to small businesses who may not have the resources. I think the example that you point to reinforces that the internet is a shared responsibility. And so the approach that we take has to be multifaceted, but it really has to be a partnership between the public and the private sector. I think where Congress can be helpful is in the area that you highlighted, not necessarily individual, but in the communities that don't have the resources to really focus on good cyber hygiene, and that's really focused on small businesses. I think that's an area where Congress and governments generally working with the private sector can be helpful, can be more helpful.
And, you know, we talk about what government can do. You know, Secretary Chertoff, we've talked a lot about Congress, but from the perspective of sort of the administrative branch. You know, NIST was given a shout out earlier. We've talked about DHS, but what are some of the ways that this administration could think about not just sort of continuing what has happened, but maybe even making a leap forward? What would you like to see?
Well,
public-private partnership.
yeah, this is a perfect example of it, exactly. As I mentioned a little bit earlier with classification, I think one thing the government could do is, and the executive order does articulate this as an objective, is really finally unify IT across the federal domain and have really a secure federal IT structure. You know, there's a lot of discussion about it, but I know when I was in office and in the succeeding administrations, it's hard to get the agency heads, first of all, to agree to operate in a unitary fashion, and also to make it a high priority. And I mean, I think one example of that, which probably everybody in this room is a victim of, was the OPM hack, where the head of that agency didn't seem to think it was important to safeguard the information because they didn't see their mission as security. So I think leading by example would be one thing. But then I think the second thing is, and this would require Congress to work with the executive branch, some kind of incentive system like we created with the Safety Act as it relates to counterterrorism technologies, some kind of an incentive system that would induce companies to build security into their systems because they would get a measure of liability protection. You know, when you deal with boards of directors, they always want to know what's the return on investment if we put money into security. And if you can point them to reduced premiums for insurance or less exposure from a liability context, that tends to get their attention.
Yeah, I think for bigger companies, that incentive is there by their business model. I think for smaller businesses, that's a huge gap. The one other thing I would add to what General Chertoff said is that we have to, yes, it's important for the government to lead by example, but they are also encumbered in their resources that they have. The government, the way it acquires technology does not work well. The procurement process is largely broken. And so I think that there are incentives and steps that Congress can take. The House has recently passed the MGT Act. I think the Senate adapting that and then moving that forward is a way of ensuring that the government is also has access to the best and latest technology as a way of advancing cybersecurity as well.
And Congressman, to both of you, have you noticed any increased awareness among your colleagues? I mean, even just in terms of Congress's own cybersecurity, that's run office to office here. You know, some offices pool their resources, but each individual member's office has to do their own cybersecurity to an extent. Have you noticed any more of your colleagues getting interested in this issue, getting smart on this issue, and what more needs to be done in that regard? Congressman Ratcliffe, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I've seen it. You know, we talk about raising the cyber hygiene level and the cyber IQ level. We need to do that, obviously, with the American people, but we need to do it with the members of Congress as well. But the good thing is members of Congress react to you know, what their constituents are saying. And so, you know, I go back to when I came in a little over 2 years ago and got the gavel for cybersecurity on Homeland. You know, folks in places like Sulphur Springs, Texas, weren't asking. They didn't really understand there was much to that. I didn't get a whole lot of credit. But fast forward now, and with the intervening and superseding events that we've had, where a rural hospital in Mount Pleasant, you know, Texas, is a victim of ransomware, or nationally, where all of this focus on Russian meddling into the election from a cyber perspective has really raised that. Members of Congress responding to constituents who go to file their tax returns on April 15th and find out someone else has already filed them and received a refund. So members are essentially whether they want to or not, they're being forced to pay more attention, and that's a good thing. That's how it makes it easier for legislators like Jim and I, who, before, their eyes would glaze over when you start to talk about cyber, now pay a little bit more attention, and you see some of the measures and the initiatives that we've had passed this year go by either voice vote or go by 415 to 7 type of margin, and we need that to continue.
Yeah, Congressman Langevin, you were doing this before it was cool, right?
That's right. Yeah, we used to get a lot of funny looks. When Michael McCaul and I started this back about a decade ago, and we started doing a deep dive on it, and we understood what a national security challenge this is, and it was going to become. There were very few people who really cared about it or thought it was an issue to be worried about, let alone being out there in the general public. Among colleagues, it was not a priority. That has thankfully changed, and it's great to have a partner like John Ratcliffe, who, despite just being here for now in his second term, has already had a huge impact on moving our cybersecurity to a stronger and better place with legislation that he's passed, or the hearings he's held in the subcommittee. And the same goes, the list is growing. Still, Mike McCaul is a leader on this, Dutch Ruppersberger. I thank them for their leadership, and a number of our other colleagues the same thing. And John hit it right on the head that I think members respond to what their constituents are concerned about most, especially. And we can't, help but now be more aware of the cybersecurity threat or challenge out there, which were because of the things that, say, Mike and I did, or John and I were doing it solely. The reality is it's because of the high-profile hacks or intrusions or compromises that have taken place, especially talking about compromising personal and private information. It has everybody's attention. So we're at a better place, just trying to figure out the way forward and the clear path of what to do next. It will be, again, an ongoing dialogue, and it will evolve over time, since it's never going to be just one right answer. It'll be that continued partnership and adaptation, if you will. So, and I'll just, one thing I wanted to mention is early part of the discussion. So, certainly education is an important part of better cyber hygiene. That's going to prevent perhaps 80 or 90% of the vulnerabilities that are out there. But as you pointed out, Tal, it's those who want to carry out implant malware on computers and encourage people to click on the wrong attachment. They're getting more and more sophisticated, and it's getting harder to discern what's legitimate and what's not. And so we are going to rely more also on technology solutions to this, and it's already happening. Whether using advanced algorithms or AI and other hardware or software solutions, we're going to get there. We're getting to a better place.
I'll sort of tee it up for you guys. Give you an opportunity to plug anything you're working on that you think you'd like to see move forward in the next year that could move the ball on this. I mean, I know you mentioned CDM as well. How obviously Congress has an oversight role. You can hold hearings, you can call attention to the issue, but what are some concrete things that you hope might come through the pipeline?
So one of the bills that I introduced last Congress that passed, and then again this Congress has passed, and Senator Daines has introduced the companion bill over in the Senate, is the Support for Rapid Innovation Act. And to me, this really goes to the core of the issue that we're talking about. What the bill really attempts to do is to help modernize the federal government, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, with respect to how it's interacting with the private sector. One of the important components of it is it extends OTAs, or other transactional authority. And so I had a chance recently to go out Silicon Valley, where the Silicon Valley Innovation Program is in effect out there, where as folks in this room know, and we've already talked about, IT acquisition and all of those challenges that you face with the federal government. Well, one of the problems is some of the very best people, some of the startups out there, they're not good. They haven't traditionally been good partners. The federal government isn't someone they can partner with because of all of the hurdles that they have to deal with and all of the challenges. What this does is allows the federal government to be, and the Department of Homeland secure to be more nimble in terms of contracting with them for specific solutions that are needed. In other words, if there's a way to, you have to train specific, say, for instance, canines to work on the border, they can use the OTA to get up with a startup and work on providing a specific solution for that. This is how we, these are the types of, engagements that we need between the Department of Homeland Security and the private sector, working to provide solutions to the problems that we have. So those types of initiatives, hopefully seeing that move over in the Senate and get to the President's desk and get signed into law. Again, none of these are going to be, there's no silver bullet piece of legislation, but all of these will have incremental value in terms of rising to the challenge that we all see here in cybersecurity.
And I should have said CDM is continuous diagnostics and monitoring. We get into those acronyms way too much, but Congressman Langevin.
Yeah, so I would say focusing on two areas. It's having been at this for a very long time, and everybody has different perspectives about what could and should be done next. The one thing that's universal is that we need the people to do the job as well in cybersecurity, and so that means recognizing that right now it's a jobs issue, and that right now cybersecurity is a field that has 0% unemployment, and that's going to only continue to challenge us going forward. And so making sure that we have an educated workforce in the short run. That means whether it's job retraining or certifications or apprenticeships, we need to focus on and support those areas. In the medium term, we need to focus at the college and university level, and we're going to be taking up the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, next week, and I'll have an amendment in the bill that is going to reinvigorate the DoD cybersecurity scholarship program, and that's going to. I have confidence that will pass. Is the Cyber Core program that the DHS and NSF are partners in having created. That's a very popular program right now. But in the longer term, we need to focus on the K-12 level. We need the digital natives who are growing up with technology and thinking about cybersecurity as something not only that they just do and they're good at, but can also be a job opportunity that comes natural for them. But just by way of example, in Rhode Island, we've partnered with Microsoft, and we now offer digital coding classes in every high school in Rhode Island. We need to further push that down to where it should be the K through 12 levels. The final thing I'll mention is partnering more with international partners around the world. I just got back from Estonia for the NATO Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, the CyCon conference, and developing international norms and rules of the road is something that we need to continue to focus on. Broader information sharing country to country is important. John and I went to Israel last May, and we learned a lot from how forward-leaning the Israelis are, including in their education system, starting in that K through 12 level. And they've got a different system, obviously, because they have the compulsory military service, and they have robust cyber units there who then go work in the private sector. But again, we have a lot to learn there. And then when we got John and I got back shortly after that, the United States and Israel signed an MOU on information sharing. We need to see that type of thing expand broader in the international community among our allies.
Yeah, that's an elite unit, right, in the Israeli military. I mean, that is what people aim for to get into.
It's actually worth noting that Israel is one of the countries that is actually taking the NIST cybersecurity framework and adapting it to their own market. So talking about the United States being in a position to lead the world as a model, I think that's a great example of that. Tal, your question creates the opportunity to actually thank the three gentlemen to my right for all the work they have done and are doing to try to make sure that our cyberspace is more secure than it is. The one other thing that I would add that it would be useful, Secretary Chertoff made the point about coordination within the government. I think that there's a significant amount of work that can be done there, leveraging the resources we have already, the strategy, the strategic framework we have from NIST. We do need a locus, a point that is coordinating all of the activity to avoid redundancy and to make sure that the efforts that are being undertaken are being deployed smartly. And that is something that I would hope close attention will be paid to by this administration and by Congress.
And Secretary, I'll give you the last question from someone on both sides of the fence.
Great. Well, listen, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. Great suggestions. I'd add only one thing. Putting aside education to get the next generation of coders or people who are going to be involved professionally in cybersecurity, I think we need to broadly educate the public about basic cyber hygiene. You know, they used to teach, when I went in grade school many decades ago, they taught us kind of basic life skills. And I think a lot of people don't get taught basic things about how to manage cyber hygiene, what not to click on, how do you verify things. You know, this is not going to deal with the advanced persistent threat, but it'll take a lot of the low-hanging fruit off the table if people do things as simple as updating or, you know, with patches and upgrades. So I think some of that basic education would be very useful.
All right, well, thank you so much to our panelists for an interesting conversation. Thank you all for joining us as well.
Next up in